Hey there, and welcome back to the Ingrain Workshop. I'm Rick, and in today's video, we're going to be tuning up my 14-inch Powermatic bandsaw. We're going to be replacing the tires, the bandsaw blade, table insert, and the bearings. So let's get started. Okay, so this is my 14-inch Powermatic bandsaw. I believe the model number is PMBS14. It's a pretty standard bandsaw that Powermatic came out with. It also has the Carter quick release for the tension on the blade. And it also has the Carter ball bearing set. So the first thing we're going to want to do is remove the table pin here on the side. And it just simply pops out. Then we're going to reach underneath and pull out our table insert. I'm going to sit these on my outfeed table. The next thing we're going to want to do is take loose the two knobs that are underneath the main table, because we're going to have to take the table off first. So let's go ahead and take these knobs off. There's one. And there's two. Now with the knobs off from underneath the table, and those knobs is what connects the main table to the actual trunnion underneath the base of the table. So the next thing we're going to do is take off the main table, and the first thing we're going to want to do is rotate the table 90 degrees so that the slot that's cut out of the table will line up with the back of the blade, and then we'll slide the table off. Now with the table off, we can zoom in here and get a better look at our ball bearing set. So this is the top ball bearing set. You have your two side bearings and then your thrust bearing in the back. And then this is the actual trunnion that sits on the base. And then you have your bottom bearing guide here, which has your two side bearings and then has your thrust bearing. Before we take these off, we just want to make sure that they're away from the blade before we take the blade off. So I'm going to go ahead and unloosen these. There's a thumb screw for the thrust bearing, and then there's a thumb screw for the side bearings, and then there's a knob on the back that you just twist counterclockwise, and it moves the bearings back from the blade. We're going to do this for the top guide bearing assembly and the bottom guide bearing assembly. So now we have the side bearings and the thrust bearings all backed away from the blade itself. We're now going to take an Allen wrench and pull back the guide bearings, the side bearings. The side bearings sit on a cam, and the cam swings in and out, so the bearings can get as close to the blade as possible. So again, we're going to take an Allen key and we're going to pull these away from the blade. So before we loosen the Allen bolt here on both sides of the side bearings, we're going to have to take, there's a Allen bolt here on the side that we're going to need to loosen first. And now with that loose, we can loosen the side bearings. And as you can see, they just rotate on a cam. And again, we're just wanting to rotate them to the furthest position away from the blade. So now our upper side bearings are far away from the blade, and then we're going to repeat the same thing on the bottom. So again, we're going to loosen the Allen bolt that's on the side of the guide. Next, we're going to loosen the cams. So now the side bearings are out of the way and they're no longer close to the blade. And the next thing we're going to do is remove the blade. So this is our Carter quick release. We're going to take and just release the tension from the blade. Now there's two positions. You've got your full tension position here at the top, and then there's a partial tension here, and then there's no tension down here. So now the blade has no tension on it. We'll open up the top wheel and also open up the bottom wheel cover. And then we'll slide the blade off. Now, as you can see, there's still tension on this blade. I still can't get it off, releasing the tension with the Carter quick release. did not release all the tension from the blade. So there's a tensioning knob at the very top of the saw, and we're just going to turn this counterclockwise. And as we turn it counterclockwise, you can see that the blade or the wheel itself is lowering. So once we take the tension off, we're then able to just slide the blade off and take the blade, and then take the blade completely off. And then just like that, we've got our blade coiled up and ready to store it away. And this is how you should store all your blades. I'll do that real quick just to show you one more time. So to fold a blade, you want the teeth pointing towards you. You want your hands at 7 o'clock and 5 o'clock, and then you can see the flexibility in the blade as I bend it down. So you want to bend it down, and at the same time, you want to bring your thumbs together. And you should probably do this with gloves, but when you've done it enough, you know that you can do it safely. So then as I bring my thumbs together, it automatically coils up by itself, and then you can take and store it. Okay, now with the blade off, I can start removing the tires. I'm going to start here on the upper wheel, and then I'll go to the lower wheel. I'm just going to use a putty knife. You could use a flat blade screwdriver and just kind of get underneath the tire. And once you get underneath it, you should be able just to pry it off, and then just work your way around the tire, and the tire comes off. Next thing we're going to do here at the bottom wheel, we're going to take the bottom tire off. And again, you just pry underneath the tire with a putty knife just to get it started, and then just work it off the wheel, and then the tire comes off the wheel. So before we take the upper guide assembly off, we're going to have to take this guide guard off. That's this black piece here. The only thing holding this to the upper guide assembly are two 10mm bolts, and we're just going to take these two 10mm bolts out. I believe this one has to come all the way out because this one's holding the air hose. The bottom one we just have to loosen because there's a groove cut in and it just slides over the bolt. I'm going to go ahead and just put the 10mm bolt back in place so I don't misplace it. And we're just going to set the air hose off to the side here by the Carter quick release. And now with the guide off, we can start taking off the upper guide assembly. Now the only thing holding the upper guide blade assembly to the saw is here at the guide post. And the only thing holding it to the guide post is this 10mm bolt. So we're going to take this 10mm bolt off, and all you have to do is loosen it, and then the whole upper guide blade assembly slides off the guide post. I'm going to set this on our outfeed table. Now for a look at the bottom guide rail assembly. You'll see that there are two 10mm bolts that hold the bottom guide blade assembly in place. So what we're going to have to do is just take these two bolts completely out. They will have to be completely removed, and then we'll be able to remove the bottom guide blade assembly. Now with the two 10mm bolts removed, the bottom guide blade assembly just simply lifts off the base. There's also a bottom guide bar underneath the bottom guide rail assembly, and it just simply comes off, and we're just going to set that to the side. So here is the bottom guide blade assembly, and this is the top guide blade assembly. My thrust bearings were turning on the upper guide blade assembly, but on the bottom guide blade assembly, you know, they're not turning. And then one of the ball bearings here on the side blade assembly isn't turning at all. So I'm going to go ahead and replace just all the bearings. So in order to do that, there are Allen bolts on the end of the side ball bearing assemblies. So we're going to take an Allen wrench and take those off. And be careful, they come with a little washer. Make sure you don't lose the washers. And then once you get the Allen bolts out, you should be able just to slide them off the shaft. You might have to use a flathead screwdriver just to get it loose from the shaft. So here, both ball bearings. So now all 4 ball bearings are off the side ball bearing shafts. And then we just have the thrust bearing. The thrust bearing, instead of having an Allen bolt, has a 10mm bolt. So we'll have to take that 10mm bolt off, and then we should be able to take the thrust bearing off. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but when I took the thrust bearing off, it looks like the shaft that it pivots around also came off. So you're going to have to remove, if this happens to you, you're going to have to remove the shaft from the ball bearing. So this is the shaft that the thrust bearing pivots on. So we're just going to set that to the side. So now we have all our 4 side bearings and our thrust bearing are now completely removed from the bottom blade guide assembly. So now we're just going to sit this to the side. And now we're going to take our upper guide blade assembly and do the same thing. We're going to move these 2 Allen screws loose so we can remove the 4 side bearings. You're going to want to make sure that you've got the side bearings pulled apart from each other, and then you want to tighten the Allen wrench here on the side, the Allen bolt, which compresses the assembly together so they won't move when you go to take out the Allen bolt in the center. So now with the Allen bolts removed, we should be able to remove these side bearings. And then you can see how the cams work here on the side bearings. Similar to the bottom guide blade assembly, the top guide blade assembly for the thrust bearing also has a 10mm bolt that we'll need to remove. So now with the upper thrust bearing off, you can see, similar to the bottom one, the actual shaft that the ball bearing rides on actually came out with the ball bearing. So you're going to have to make sure that you remove it from the center, and it should just slide out, and then just sit the shaft to the side. So you should have a total of 10 bearings. 4 side bearings for the upper, 4 side bearings for the bottom, and then 1/3 thrust bearing for the top and 1/3 thrust bearing for the bottom. So these are the new thrust bearings that we're going to install, or the new bearings that we're going to be installing. I ordered these off of Amazon, and I'll drop a link in the video description below to where you can pick them up. These ball bearings are 608 ZZs, and if you've got a Powermatic 14-inch bandsaw, that's the ball bearings that we took out. So we're going to be replacing them with the same ball bearings that we took out. I think they're maybe $20, $15 to $20 off of Amazon. So it's worth replacing them. And they do come in a pack of 10. So we're going to kind of work in reverse order. So we've got the upper guide blade assembly, and then we're going to take and install the thrust bearing first. So we've got to take the thrust bearing shaft, slide the new ball bearing on the shaft, take our 10mm bolt, and then screw it back onto the upper guide blade assembly, tighten it down, tighten down the 10mm bolt, and the thrust bearing is now installed. So now let's install the 4 side bearings. Then we're going to install the Allen bolt back on, and you can see they turn freely. We'll install the other two side bearings, tighten down the Allen bolt, make sure they turn freely, and then we're done. So now we've replaced the thrust bearing and the 4 side bearings on the upper guide blade assembly. So now we're completely done with the upper guide blade assembly. We're going to set this off to the side. We're going to bring back the bottom guide blade assembly, and we're going to start with the thrust bearing. And again, we're going to take the thrust bearing shaft and just slide it into the thrust bearing. Then with the 10mm bolt, we're going to reinstall the new thrust bearing. And we're going to tighten down the 10mm bolt, make sure that the bearing turns freely. And then we're going to install the 4 side bearings. And that's it. We've now installed the 4 side bearings, the 1 thrust bearing for the bottom blade assembly. And now we're complete with both the upper and the bottom blade assembly. And we can reinstall both of those onto the bandsaw. Okay, so before we reinstall the bottom bearing assembly and the top bearing assembly, we're going to go ahead and change our band wheel tires. The way I'm going to show you how to install the tires, you do not have to soak this in hot water to make it expandable or anything like that. You can install it directly out of the package. Other than cutting it down to the thickness you need, you can now take and install it on the bandsaw wheel with a method I'm going to show you right now. And this method is the quickest and easiest way to install a tire on a bandsaw wheel. So what you're going to need to install the tire on the wheel is probably some things you've just got laying around the garage. You'll need 2 spring clamps. You're going to need a cordless drill. You're also going to need a 3/8 inch dowel. I'm using red oak, roughly 3 inches long. And you're just going to chuck that right up to your drill. And then I'm going to use a 3/8 inch and a 1 inch washer over the dowel. And this is what we're going to use to install the tire on the wheel. So the first thing you're going to want to do is take and put the tire on the wheel and install a spring clamp. Once you've got the first spring clamp on, now you're going to rotate the wheel, and then you're going to get as much of the tire on the wheel as you can, and then you're going to install the second spring clamp. So now we've got the 2 spring clamps installed. We've got the tire on the wheel as much as we can. Now we're going to take our drill. So we're going to place the wood dowel between the wheel and the tire, and then we're slowly going to tilt the drill up at an angle and engage the drill. And as the drill rotates, it will feed the tire onto the wheel. And as you can see, the tire is now on the wheel, and then I'm just making some final adjustments, just sliding the tire in place, taking off the 2 spring clamps, and then just like that, the tire is on the wheel. That is the easiest way that you can install a bandsaw tire on the bandsaw wheel, is just using a 3/8 inch wood dowel. It doesn't have to be red oak. That's just all that I had in the shop. A couple of washers, a drill, and then a couple of spring clamps, and that's all you need. And again, I didn't prep this tire at all. I didn't soak it in hot water, didn't do anything. And that's how to properly feed the tire onto the wheel. Okay, now that I went ahead and did the same thing to the bottom wheel, so now we've replaced both tires on the upper and the lower wheels. Next thing we're going to do is now reinstall our top and bottom ball bearing assemblies. And we're going to do that just the reverse of how we took them off. Okay, now we have the bottom guide blade assembly back in place. Now we can install the upper guide blade assembly. So for the upper guide blade assembly, we're just going to take the 10mm bolt loose, slide it over the guide post, and then tighten it down. So now the upper guide blade assembly is mounted to the guide post. Now we need to reinstall the guide, the blade guide, and the air hose. So we're going to remove the upper 10mm bolt. We'll leave the lower one in place because the guide rail has slots for them to slide under the washers. Then the air hose, we're going to have to feed the bolt through the hole and then screw it in place. And we'll tighten both 10mm bolts. Now the blade guide is now in place. And then the next thing we're going to do is install the blade. Okay, so this is the new blade that we're going to install. It's a Timberwolf. It's a 1/4 inch blade with 6 teeth per inch. For this particular saw, since it does have the riser block, it takes 105 inch blade length. So this is a 105 inch Timberwolf, 1/4 inch, 6 teeth per inch. Okay, so to uncoil the blade, we're just going to let it loose in our hands. And you'll see that there's 3 rings. You want to grab 2 of them in one hand. That way you have a figure 8. Once you see this figure 8 configuration, then you'll just want to take and open it up. And I definitely do not recommend just throwing these blades on the floor. You're going to damage the teeth, and you know, it's a lot easier just to open them the correct way. I don't have gloves. I am wearing glasses, but I would recommend probably wearing gloves and glasses depending on the size of the blade. Okay, so we're going to start around the bottom wheel and just put it on the tire and then work our way up to the upper. And then once we get it on the upper tire, so once you get it on the tire, you want to make sure that the blade, not the blade, but the gullet of the blade is riding in the center of the wheel. And if you need to, I've got the Carter quick tension release, so I've got all the tension on it. Then there's also a tensioning knob. So here's a better view at the back of the saw. You can see that the Carter tensioning post is in the tension position. This position would be partial tension, and this is total tension off. And then you've got a fine-tuned tensioning rod at the top, and you've got a spring, and the Powermatics come with a tensioning spring which has a scale on it. And as you can see the scale, I've got it tensioned for a 1/4 inch. So the bottom of the tensioning spring is here at the 1/4 inch mark on the scale. And you know, some people don't like to use that as just a reference. I like to use that, and then I can fine tune it one way or the other. But you know, just to get a rough tension on it, that's typically what I do. And then this knob here is what causes the top wheel to move in this lateral direction. The bottom wheel is fixed, and I guess that's where you hear the term coplanar. But you do want to adjust this because depending on the width of the blade, you want it so the blade or the gusset, the deepest part of the gusset is going to ride in the center of the wheel. So as I hand turn it, I will adjust the knob on the side to adjust the wheel so that the actual blade, the gusset of the blade, is riding in the center of the wheel. Now the blade itself is not in the center of the wheel, but the deepest part of the gusset is in the center of the wheel, and that's what you want. So in case you're not familiar with the gusset or the terminology of the gusset of the blade, this part right here is the deepest part of the gusset. So when you hear someone refer to the gusset of the blade, this is the deepest part right here of the gusset of the blade. And that's the part of the blade that you want in the center of the wheel. Okay, so now with the blade on the wheels, on the machine, the next thing we want to do is adjust or fine-tune our bearings. We're going to adjust our thrust bearings for the top and bottom blade assemblies, and then we're going to adjust our side bearings for the top and bottom blade assemblies. So let's do that next. Okay, so the first thing we're going to adjust is our thrust bearing right here. And you can see that, you know, it's pretty far from behind the blade. So we have a thumb screw here we're going to make sure is loose. And then we have a knob on the back. And as you turn this knob clockwise, it brings the bearing closer and closer to the back of the blade. Now, we don't want the bearing touching the blade. We want about a 1/16 of an inch clearance between the back of the blade and the thrust bearing. And once we get that dialed in, we're going to do the side bearings. So before we adjust the side bearings, we have to make sure that we bring them forward or back. You want the actual bearing to be right at the back of the gusset. You don't want the bearing to be riding on the teeth. So you want to make sure that you adjust the bearings in and out so they're just below or just behind the gusset. So we've adjusted our bearing so it's just behind the gusset. And once you do that, you want to tighten down your thumb screw so it doesn't move back and forth. Next, we're going to adjust the bearing and adjust it probably about a 1/16 of an inch between the blade. And again, when you're adjusting the side bearings on the cam, you want to make sure you're coming at it from the down position. That way, as the blade hits the bearing, it's going to want to have a tendency to knock it away from the blade, instead of if you tightened it from the top, it would want to take, and once it hit the side bearing, it'd want to move that bearing into the blade, and then causing you to heat up your blade and ruin your blade and your bearing. So always, when you're moving the cam, move it in the down position. Now we're going to adjust the side bearing on the right side, and again we're going to come to it from the down position, and there we go. So now we've tightened our thumb screws for our thrust bearing and our side bearings. So when we turn the bandsaw, no bearings should be moving. So you shouldn't be touching any bearings at this point. Now, if I take and just with a little pressure, slide the blade just with my fingers, you'll see that the thrust bearing moves. And that's how you want it. You don't want it touching the thrust bearing. You want it about a 1/16 of an inch away. Same thing with the side bearings. So now let's adjust the bottom guide blade assembly. So again, we'll take and loosen our thumb screw here for the thrust bearing, and then we'll adjust the knob that brings the thrust bearing out and close to the back of the blade. Now again, we don't want to be touching the blade and causing our bearing to move. So we want to be about a 1/16 of an inch behind the blade, and then tighten down your thumb screw. So now if I just apply a little pressure with the back of my hand to the blade and move it up and down, both the top and bottom thrust bearings are turning. But if I take that pressure off and just turn the wheel with my hand, neither the top or bottom thrust bearings move. So the next thing we're going to do is adjust our side bearings. So again, our thumb screw is loose. Now we're going to move them closer to the blade. And again, we only want to bring them out far enough so they sit at the back of the gullet. And then once you get them there, tighten down your thumb screw. So again, the Allen bolt on the side we need to loosen. And then we need to adjust our side bearings so they're about 1/16 of an inch from the blade. And once you've got them in position, you tighten the side Allen nut, and then that locks the cam in position. So now our bearings have all been tuned. None of the bearings are moving when you just spin the wheel. So now, just to verify, everything looks good as far as the tuning goes. So now I think we're at a point where we can go ahead and put back the table. And then that should wind up the tune-up process on this bandsaw. So now I'm just going to put the knobs back on the bottom of the table, close the wheel covers, and we should be good to go. I'm going to adjust the guide down a little bit. Next, I'm going to insert the table insert. Put the table pin back in. Now I'm going to plug the table, or plug the bandsaw back in. It's now plugged back in. Turn it on. Now we're going to test and see if our table is level. So I'm just going to take a 2x4. Make a small cut. Then I'm going to bring it around from the back side. And our table doesn't completely line up with that cut. So we're going to adjust the table, make another cut. And you can see that it lines up perfect. So now we have our table level in the right and left direction. So for leveling your table from left to right, all you really have to do is just take the 2x4 like I showed you and just cut a small slot on the front and then bring it around to the back. And if that lines up, then you know that your table is flat all the way across. And then that's pretty much it. I've got a small 1/4 inch blade on here because I wanted to do some intricate cutting. If I have to cut circles, the 1/4 inch blade will allow you to cut a smaller radius circle. And then I do have wider resaw blades for when I'm resawing lumber. I can take and then resaw utilizing the fence or the miter gauge as well. But just keep in mind, whenever you're changing out the blades, you are going to have to go through that tune-up process every time. You're going to have to adjust the upper and bottom blade guide assemblies, and you're going to need to adjust your thrust bearing and then your side bearings every time, because the width of the blade will cause you to have to make that adjustment. But you know, that's why a lot of people do have more than one bandsaw, one that's just dedicated for intricate cutting with a smaller blade like this 1/4 inch blade, and then maybe a larger bandsaw that has a 3/4 inch to 1 inch resaw blade that is strictly dedicated to resawing lumber. But with a 14 inch Powermatic bandsaw, this is all a small shop needs, because you can just swap out the blades fairly easy, tune it up, and then resaw your lumber accordingly. So this machine doesn't have any trouble resawing lumber. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. I hope this video helps you out in your project. If it did, please leave it a thumbs up. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. I'll leave a link in the video description below to all the products and equipment that I used on this video. As always, this is Rick with the Ingrain Workshop. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for watching.